So I thought we'd start this conversation off just really light and just ask Jordan what the meaning of life is. Just start off like really simple. That was like the easiest way to do it. Just kidding. I
I got
thought,
an answer for that.
yeah. So here's the one I actually thought about. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation about what is awakening. What does it mean to become awake, or what does it mean to have an awakening, and how that shows up for people. And the reason I thought that'd be worthwhile to have a conversation about is I feel that we are in right now the midst of an awakening period in humanity. If you go back in time, there's been awakening periods throughout history. A really simple one that most people know about is, so there was like the Dark Ages in like the medieval times. I'm not a historian, so there was the Dark Ages, and then there was like this age of enlightenment or age of awakening in theory. And the theory behind that actually had a lot to do with the Brits or the Europeans traveling to India, finding tea, and then they were, instead of just drinking alcohol all the time, all they did was drink tea. So instead of being on downers, they were on uppers. And then there was this huge influx of art and music, and there's this massive influx where it changed the course of history, because instead of just being poisoned and drinking poisoned water and drinking alcohol, they had tea now. So that was like the age of I forget the name of that period of time. So the Dark Ages, then this age happened. In an interesting way, we are entering in, and we are actually part of right now, we can call it the age of enlightenment or the age of awakening, or an awakening time throughout history. So I thought we'd start off and talk about like what awakening is, what actually that has to do with, what happens in your brain. The Renaissance. Yeah, thanks, Mary. I thought it'd be worthwhile to have a conversation about how that manifests for people. And then I thought there's some ties that we can have a conversation about, because with awakening, there might be also become like, what's a midlife crisis? What is an existential crisis? What does it mean to go through these shifts, and how can we better, as yogis and as people, recognize and transition through our awakening process maybe more elegantly than maybe it has been in the past, instead of buying a yacht and selling all your possessions and running to Hawaii, which could be fun too. So what is awakening?
Are we making a distinction between awakening, or the act of waking up, and is that a part of liberation? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about something different?
I guess we'd have to talk about like what liberation is.
Right. That's when we got to define these terms that we're using.
So I think it'd be worthwhile to start really broad, really specific, and then get really broad about like what a liberation, or being liberated is, and then talk about that.
So, well, okay. So liberation in a yogic context is all yogic spiritual traditions. The goal of those practices is liberation from suffering. But that doesn't make it much better, does it? Because then we have to say, what is suffering, right?
Well, I think you almost have to backtrack a little bit before you go forward. You almost have to paint the framework for what are these things we're going to be discussing to be able to have the conversation moving forward.
Right. So which one do we want to start with?
Let's start with so again, everyone, the conversation we're going to have is like, what is awakening, or what does it mean to wake up, or in this life,
or as the youngins like to say, when you woke.
Be woke. So I think that to start about it is like what the goal of having what the goal is of why we practice yoga at all, why we do any kind of spiritual searching period. What does it mean to be a human, and how does a human life, how are you you're pretty much destined to suffer in some way or have some kind of pain. And then what liberation is. And
that's an important point that you just kind of stumbled over right there. Is pain suffering? That's one of those things that we tend to, it's just a phrase that we say pain and suffering. So we automatically put the two things together. But I would argue that the suffering that we're talking about in yoga is separate from physical pain. Physical pain, as long as you have a body, is an inevitability. It's not like if I become enlightened or I wake up that now I can break my leg and I don't feel any pain. Or I could go to the dentist and have a root canal and be like, no, I don't need the Novocaine. I'm good. I'm an enlightened being. I can transcend the pain. Now, but at the same time, there is a level of that. Like maybe you could go in and have the root canal and meditate yourself into a place where you were okay with the pain, right? Like if you were a very strong practitioner of meditation. But really all you're doing at that point is distancing your consciousness from the experience of the pain. You're still experiencing pain, right? Your physical body is still experiencing pain. So you may be able to transcend physical pain, but you're always still going to experience it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So physical pain is different from suffering. But at the same time, if you're in a lot of physical pain, you're going to be wasting so much of your energy on trying to tolerate the pain every day that you won't have enough energy to go to a higher level of cognition and have an awakening, right? And so that's why that's the main purpose of yoga asana is, does everybody know what asana means at this point? The postures that we do, the hatha yoga postures that we all do. That's the main purpose of those, is simply to try to minimize pain and disease in the body so that the body is not a distraction. Now, there are plenty of people that deal with physical pain all the time and they still manage enlightenment. It's just that's one of their obstacles, one of the things in their path that they have to overcome. But it is a very challenging. I mean, anybody that deals with constant physical pain on a daily basis will tell you that it's exhausting, right? So then what do we mean by suffering then? If it's not physical pain, anybody want to, it's one thing for me to just give you an answer, but it's a whole nother thing. The whole purpose of this conversation is for you to chew on it and not be afraid to spit out an answer. And maybe it's not perfect. Don't be afraid of just throwing something out there. So what is suffering? Anyone?
I think suffering is when something's like not aligned or contradictory, or like if what you're thinking and what you're seeing don't line up, there's like a sense of suffering from that.
I think suffering.
Can I put some words in your mouth?
Yes, please.
Okay, so are you saying that suffering is when our thoughts in our head, we think things should be other than what they actually are? Right. So having the way I always put that, the way you hear me say it in class all the time, is having a reality that's out of alignment with the truth that causes suffering. I would also argue that suffering is a cycle that you get stuck in, right? Like everything, like anything that's like anything pleasurable has the potential to cause suffering, right? Like let's just take alcohol. Alcohol is an obvious one, right? It can be very pleasurable to have a couple drinks and that's totally fine, right? But when it becomes a compulsion or an addiction, I'm drinking because and while I'm drinking, I'm saying to myself, I really don't want to be drinking, but I'm doing it anyway. Now it's a cycle of behavior that you can't stop, right? So getting trapped into a pattern of thinking is the same way, right? Is everybody kind of following me on that? Does that make sense? Getting a few nods. This is why, like, Patanjali yogis, classical ascetic monk yogis were ascetics, because anything pleasurable has the potential to cause suffering. So they would just renounce anything that brought pleasure to the body or the senses, because ultimately they're going to wind up sucking you in, right? But I never really, I get that theory, but it's like, I also have self-control. So, or maybe you don't. Maybe that's why you just need to renounce everything and just be done with it. I get that theory, but personally, I have self-control. So I think, later on, as yoga philosophy evolved into Tantra, which was meant for ordinary, everyday people that had families and children and jobs, the idea is that everything is the divine. So if you can see the divine in the glass of beer that you're drinking and have that be a celebration of divinity, then that's a good thing. But if it becomes that opposite, where it's a compulsion, now it's dragging you down. It's lowering your frequency.
Jordan, we got two things. We got Annie who wants to say something.
Okay.
We have two comments about pain.
Let me look at Annie, go ahead and say what you want to say. Let me look at the chats here. Go ahead.
Well, I guess it's kind of like what you've already said, but I feel like my suffering is often that I'm choosing to analyze my pain over and over, and kind of it becomes a tape that I play, and it's strangely satisfying sometimes to replay this negative thought tape. So it becomes addictive, kind of, to analyze and come up with all of these negative thoughts about the pain.
Right, exactly. Thank you. That was a great way of explaining the cycle, that I'm like getting stuck in a cycle. And the way that you like want to keep playing it over and over again, think about when you have like Penelope's losing her teeth. So this is a very obvious example. When you have a loose tooth, how you can't stop effing with it. You just want to keep even though it hurts and it feels but you can't stop. Like your tongue just keeps going to the thing, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, and let's see. Kathy said.
Yeah, I think it's more, to me, it's physical. The pain is physical and the suffering is mental. So
right.
There's times I remember you would say in some classes, like you just said it today, not every day is going to be wonderful on a party. And the key for me has been, as I'm sure many of us here have dealt with certain things that we have found incredibly challenging, is if I can say it will pass, if I can be in that moment to say, just like where we are right now, this too shall pass. It's not going to be a forever, right? So to me, the pain is physical and the suffering is a mental.
Yeah, I agree, 100%.
Yeah.
I had this. Do you remember? I think it was 5 years ago. We had like no snow all winter long, and then February it was like one giant blizzard after another. We got buried in like 8 feet of snow in like 4 weeks. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it got to this point where I was so at my house. I walk out my door and I've got this big patio area, and then above that patio area is a deck. It kind of looks like a roof over it. So I was shoveling the snow off my patio area and then going upstairs and shoveling the snow off the deck. And there was so much snow that it got to a point where there were these walls of snow all the way around to the bottom of the deck with like this little bit of light. Like there was literally I couldn't put the snow up any higher. And it had walled me in on like all three sides. And I was standing out there looking at these walls of snow and thinking to myself, I know that by August, this is all going to be gone and everything's going to be green. But when you're standing there looking at the walls of snow, you just can't fathom how it's going to happen, right? And that's like a perfect metaphor for suffering. right? When you're basically walled in, you're looking at like, and you're like, I have no idea how I'm going to get out of here, right? And so now you're suffering. You're like, ah. So to get back to what Braxton was asking then, what is awakening? Well, awakening is liberating yourself from that suffering by becoming aware of it. That is the awakening moment. I think most people that I know are walking around suffering incredibly, but they've been suffering for so long that they don't even know they're suffering anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They just think that's the way life is. Like, and you can hear it and see it in the way, like if I ask you how you're doing and they're like, you know, I'm good. Not as good as can be expected. Phrases like that. You know, I'm getting by, you know. Right? When really, like, we should be literally having the time of our lives. Right? This is, we're here in physical form. We are divine energy that took on a physical form. Literally, the word divine, that root div in Sanskrit, means to play. That's what we're here to, we came here in physical form to play. Because when we don't have a form, we can't do anything. We're just consciousness. We have to take on form to create and to act and to dance and to make music and to all those things that we love to do, because we're consciousness and creativity, right? That in yogic terms, you've heard Shiva and Shakti before, right? You usually think Shiva's the guy and Shakti's the girl, and they're making it, and that's what the universe all the time, right? Maybe you've heard that before, but really what that is just a metaphor for Shiva is consciousness, which is consciousness has no form. It's the void, it's nothingness, right? But in that nothingness is the potential for all the things, for everything. And so then Shakti has to come along with her creativity and takes the potential, that energy of Shiva, that's the potential for everything, and with her creativity, she makes all the things, right? Planets. And so we are the embodiment of Shiva and Shakti, which is why we are conscious and why we all feel the need to create in our own ways. Does that make sense? Yes. Everyone, you've got that look of like, that was some truth. Right? And you hear me say that all the time. Like when we think of truth like an idea, but truth is an action. Like when truth happens, it affects you, right? Like you feel it, like, oh, and that feeling is your perception, your individual reality, lining back up to what's true, right? And that it's like, I like the example of you're driving along in your car and it's kind of drizzling, right? And so you've got your windshield wipers on intermittent, right? So it's only like wiping them off every once in a while. And as that drizzle's coming down, the more drizzle that comes down, the blurrier what you're looking at actually gets. But you can still see the road. You know where you're going. You're not going to really hit anything, but your vision is blurry. And then the windshield wiper comes across and goes, and all of a sudden it's crystal clear, right? That's your reality aligning to the truth is a very similar feeling. Like you were seeing it, it was just blurry and you didn't realize it was blurry, and then till something came along and all of a sudden it's crystal clear and you've realigned your perception back to what truth is. And that's not like, that's an awakening moment. That's an aha moment, as we like to say, or, you know, the light bulb goes off, right? That we've got all these analogies for it, but those are physical responses that you're having to truth acting on you, right? So before you even realize that you are suffering, basically what's happened is, I like to think of, so imagine I gave you a glass of water, and in that glass of water, I put a bunch of LSD, right? And then I said, here, drink this water. And then I said, go to bed. And you went to bed and you fell asleep. And like an hour and a half later, you woke up tripping balls. Like the floor's swirling colors and there's a purple elephant in your living room. Like if it happened that quickly, you'd be like, there's something wrong. I'm not seeing things clearly, right? That's obvious. But now let's assume that I just gave you the tiniest microdose of this LSD in this water. And I did this every day for 15 years. So gradually, as it's building up in your system, and you're starting to trip just a little bit more, just a little bit more, just a little bit more over this really long period of time. So by the time you're tripping balls, you don't even realize that you're tripping anymore. It's happened so gradually that that's your reality. That's just the way you're seeing things. Does that make sense? So we've all basically been doing that our whole life through all of our memories and experiences. All of those memories and all those experiences and all the knowledge we've obtained over the years and all the books we've read and all the movies we've watched, all of that information is constantly changing our perception of the present moment. So that we get to a point where we're at whatever age and we're suffering, and we don't even know that we're suffering until maybe we read something or we see something or an event happens in our life that causes us to stop and look at it, or you meet the right teacher or whatever. Something happens and you think to yourself, you realize, oh, I am suffering. That's awakening. That's an aha moment. Just realizing that I am, in fact, walled in by snow and I can't see the way out, right? But that is huge. That moment is that's the start of your spiritual practice, right? Now, there's any number of things that could derail you as you pursue that practice, right? There's plenty of people that get a certain way down their path and they, for whatever reason, fall off the wagon or get discouraged or think that it's not possible, or worry, doubt, all those things come into play as we're trying to pursue this liberation from our suffering. Suffering is more, I'm just looking at the comments.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Emma said it really well about the suffering is a more subjective, person to person, based on our expectations. Pain is more objective. So like, I think the idea that the pain, your body can experience pain because your brain, you have these nerve endings and this nerve ending sent into your brain, it causes a response in your physical body. Suffering, I think even like a simple way to put it is people like talk about my pain, my suffering. It's like when you start to create your pain, your suffering as a unique experience to yourself. And then like you kind of talked about before, it's that almost like that interesting cycle of suffering where it's like I'm starting to fall into the pattern of my own, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, which actually takes us further away from the collective in an interesting kind of way.
Yeah.
And so I think then, so if we kind of unpackaged pain and suffering, so now we kind of have this idea of what pain is. Like pain is, it's one of those Buddhist quotes, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Everyone's like heard that quote, you heard it say. I've actually recently found out that quote is actually slightly misread. It's that like, it's actually pain is inevitable is going to be there. But it's not that suffering is optional. It's that like, it's that suffering is a mind state on your life. And yes, you can make the decision if you want to not suffer, but it's about like looking at a painting and you're really, really, really close to that painting, and you can see the fine brush strokes in the painting. But by taking smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller step backs, you actually can see that the suffering is not as big as it was. It's about changing your whole outlook on the painting or on the suffering itself, right? Which is why I think some of us go to therapists and we present our suffering to them, and then they pair it back to us, and you're like, oh, that's not that big of a deal. Like I totally like I have such better clarity on this now, right? So, and then the question, I guess, Jordan, we can kind of go from there, is about this liberation. So if yoga is about, you already kind of break down what liberation is all about?
Well, hold on. Before we move on, so there's a couple of good points in the comments that we should go over. So Kathy says, so you think the awakening is the acceptance of what is? Yes. Yeah. That moment that you like, so we have, we, as through our memory, through our experience and our knowledge and all that stuff, we build up this idea that of the way the universe ought to be. And that's not in alignment with the way that it actually is. Like, just take an example of poverty or war, right? We think those things shouldn't exist, right? And we should work to make them not exist because of that feeling. But the fact of the matter is that they do exist. And wanting it to not exist and feeling that it should not exist should be encouragement to work towards it. But if you've got an attachment, this is where it gets tricky. If you got an attachment to the idea that the world shouldn't have those things in it, and then you get frustrated with the fact that they're still here, and that causes the suffering. So by accepting that that is what is and being okay with that, then you can work with it. And think of it, don't I say that to you all the time when you come into your yoga posture, right? You come into the pose and you might want it to be something other than, you might want your hips to be more open than they are, but you have to accept that this is how much my hips are open right now. Once you accept that, then you can work forward from that. But as long as you're just fighting with what is, you're suffering. Does that make sense? Okay, so why do you think we take ourselves or our perceptions so seriously when we're ultimately here to play? Because we've forgotten that we're here to play. We started taking the game way too seriously. I mean, Alan Watts makes that abundantly clear. That's like his whole bit. Like, you should definitely listen to some Alan. Like, look at it. We all have been around young kids. Look at they're here to play, right? That is their, and then we train that out of ourselves through education, and I got to take this seriously, and I got to plan my future and get a good job, and do all those things and check off all those boxes. And in that process of taking the game so seriously, we forgot that it was a game. That's the bummer, right? But part of the awakening is realizing, like, oh yeah, I get to play the role of yoga teacher. That's what I'm here for this time, right? Or whatever your job, I get to play the role of dad. I get to play the role of being male. I love this beard, right? Like, I'm all of the things. You don't change the thing. Like, a lot of my students struggle with is like, okay, so after I wake up, after I have this enlightenment moment, then what? And I'm like, then you put on your clothes and you brush your teeth and you go to work. Like, nothing, that doesn't change. It's your perception of, you're like, hey, I'm a human. I get to brush my teeth. I get to go to work today. We're all feeling that. How many times before this happened did you say, oh, I wish I had a month off? And now that you actually have it, you're like, I miss work, right? Maybe to some extent, or maybe you don't. Maybe it's time for a new career. But your perception of why you're doing the things you're doing, you've heard us say things like, change your perception from, oh, I've got all this laundry to do, to, wow, I have all these clothes to wear, which means I have to do laundry. Or change your perception from, oh, the sink is full of dishes again. Well, that means everybody's fed. So it's about shifting your perception back to, I'm here to play. And when you change it back to a game, you engage in it far more than you do when you feel like it's something you have to do, right? Oh, I have to go to work. Oh, I've got to take care of my kids. No, I get to take care of my kids. I get to go do this thing that gives me money. Maybe my job is just something that gives me money to do the other things that I really want to do, right?
But I guess, Jordan, I would ask, like, kind of to pull us back over a second a little bit more. So we have like this pain and suffering, and we have like this yoga practice, and like the idea of like the liberation is a liberation from suffering, which helps us get the perspective on like that our suffering is optional, I should suppose. The pain's gonna be inevitable. And then we like, let's say, I think back towards the times that I've had these awakening moments. It's like, let's just go, like, I think we've all probably had one in a yoga class, potentially, or like one while doing
I
some,
hope they had at least
some
one
kind of
by
practice.
now.
You know, and I can speak to like one for one of mine. It's like, you know, you go into the room, you get into your first down dog, and then you blink, and then you wake up from Shavasana, and you're like, I don't know what the hell just happened for the last 90 minutes. And all of a sudden you come back to this reality. And then you have this moment of being like, okay, so I was here, but I wasn't here. And then you start to walk around the room or the world, and you see the world a little bit differently. And then now the funny thing about that, I guess the challenge the reason I want to talk about it is we all live this reality where we do yoga together. We talk about these things. You hear these philosophical ideas. Now let's just make up a character. Let's take like Bob, the construction worker, who's now been quarantined for 5 weeks and is going through an awakening and doesn't have any of the tools or the skills to be able to articulate this language. And now he's like, fuck is going on over here, you know? And so I guess the question is like, how would we articulate that to somebody, what that experience, besides saying you're waking up, is like there a way to maybe we can all think of it to explain it to someone who doesn't have the language that we have?
You got to break it down like we're doing right now. What do I mean by those statements that I'm saying? Because Bob is in a really unfortunate position. Waking up without having any knowledge behind what's happening is a horribly uncomfortable experience. It's not, you know, have you seen that meme it's been kicking around for years now? It's like, everybody thinks a spiritual awakening is going to be like this. And it's like a person sitting on a mountaintop at sunrise and everything's beautiful. And sometimes it is like that. And underneath is another picture. It says it's actually like this, and it's like it's somebody with like the blankets pulled up around their chin, and they're going, "I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay." Right? Because your whole structure, your reality, the foundations of your is being dismantled, right? And you have no one guiding you towards helping the knowledge is what helps you see it clearly. Yeah. Otherwise, you just don't know what is happening. You just feel like everything's falling apart. And there's plenty, I've heard the argument a whole lot of times that from yogis that they think that a lot of people that are in quote unquote mental institutions that have like these psychotic breaks have had, Kundalini energy wake up inside their body, and their nervous system and their neurology is not prepared for that influx of energy, and things break, right? There's a reason why yogis protected this information, and there's a reason why there's a method of preparation. All these asanas, all these breathing exercises, the pranayamas, the breathing exercises, are all preparing the physiology and the biology of you to handle raising your energy to a higher frequency. And if that happens when you're unprepared, it has catastrophic effects. It's not a good thing. It's hard on people. Will they survive it and get through it? And maybe if the yogis would say, if they're blessed by, if they have the divine grace that gets them through it. But it's going to be hard for those. It's going to be really hard for those people, which is part of why I'm so behind being on the internet right now so much for free, because I think people need access to that. That's the only way they're going to get through it easy.
So you think a midlife crisis is the same thing as an awakening?
Yeah, watch the behavior of somebody in a midlife crisis. They're not awakening, they're suffering. Right? They're just spiraling out into deeper and deeper suffering. They're clinging at all kinds of sense objects and pleasurable things to try and make themselves feel happy again. That's how they feel like what they really want to do is get back to playing the game. But they don't have that knowledge or that understanding, and so they just start playing in very destructive ways. Their play becomes, let me just dismantle everything that I've built so far, right? Let me get rid of my family. Let me get rid of my job. Let me buy a new car. Let me, do all this stuff that is, all of those things that I just mentioned are attachments and sense objects, right?
Mm. So I guess like what I like start to think about when it comes to these conversations is like, I just made that comment about this fabricated guy named Bob, and Shauna said, tell Bob that you finally get to slow down and appreciate what is in front of you. And I can imagine saying that to Bob and having him go fuck yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you want to tell me to slow down, you fucking dick? Fuck, And so I think the question.
Well, and what that is like, it's like he's a wounded, what's her name? Rachel Bruck has that great quote where she's like, he's a wounded dog, and you come up on him and you're like, hey buddy, how you doing? He's like, ah, and you're like, oh, I see that you're hurt. Like that his pain is coming out. He's trying to protect himself from getting hurt anymore, right? Everything's in upheaval. He doesn't feel secure. He's got no grounding. Everything's feeling like it's being pulled out from under him, and you come up and tell him, hey man, just chill out. He's like, fuck you, everything's falling apart. He's got no understanding to go on, right? All he's got is feeling, and all of the feelings that he's having are causing him to go into fight or flight mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Emma, The Good Place is absolutely a show about liberation. It's phenomenal. I talked about that in our teacher training actually when it came up, but
I haven't seen.
It's great. It's pretty much a show about awakening. Andrea and Monique, I think we'll respond to both those statements.
Yes, we will get to those in time. I saw them both, but I feel like they derail us on the thread that we're on right now, but I'll loop back around to it, okay?
So if we got this pain, we got this suffering, and then we have this liberation, and then we have like this awakening, starts of awakening, and we also have this like midlife crisis, which are all kind of like the same things. Now let's say like the thing that I want to now explore is like, let's see how you start to have this mini awakening. Like when I first did my teacher training, Masaki said to me, he said, you're going to do this week, and you're going to come back, and everyone you're going to know when you get back is going to have no idea what you're talking about. You're going to feel incredibly alienated for about a month. And I was like, no. And I came back and I felt super alienated for like a full month because I was like in a completely different mind space. Now, I guess the question then is, did I reacclimate to society and I like slow down the awakening process? Or then did you start to find ways as someone who's waking up to be able to then communicate with people who are not waking up? And so I guess the question is, what are the steps then in terms of like where this journey ends? Or what are we striving to once we start this? Because I think we're going to have a lot of people right now when the yoga studios do open back up, or a lot of people right now who in the next like 6 months, 3 months are going to be at the beginning stages of the awakening process. And they're going to have no tools on how to deal with it. And I mean, alcohol sales are up by 245% right now. I mean, it's like ridiculous. I mean, like there's no one really has any idea how to cope with this. So the question is now, how as people who are on this journey do we help each other? But also like, what's the next step? Let's say those people get past the alcohol phase. Let's go to the next phase. What do we do next?
Practice. You need and read. You need knowledge and practice. That's the way you get through it. So there's an old Zen saying, and Zen is pretty much just the Japanese version of yoga philosophy. And they're very like they fit together very. They say Zen, the moment of awakening can happen in an instant, or it could take you 30 years or 30 lifetimes. And what they mean by that is you could just realize all this stuff and accept it, and in a moment be liberated. But most people just don't work that way. And so it becomes a much more gradual process. Think of somebody like, everybody's pretty familiar with Eckhart Tolle, right? Yes, no, Eckhart Tolle. Everybody. Do you know his story? How he basically, he had this enlightenment moment. You could say his his kundalini moved all in an instant, and it basically like shattered his brain. He couldn't integrate everything that he came to understand back into wakeful consciousness, and he had to basically lay on a park bench and be homeless for 2 months. And then or 2 years maybe. It was a long time that he was homeless for. And during that period, he was basically just like sitting on a park bench staring at like a paper cup in the sewer, trying to process all this stuff. And he eventually did it and then integrated it back into wakeful consciousness, and now he's this guy that we all know because he managed to take this understanding and integrate it back into wakeful consciousness. Now, my experience was so much more gradual than that. Like, I had aha moments. Looking back on it now, it felt like every one of those aha moments was the planting of a seed that then through continuing to practice, it was like I was cultivating that seed. I was watering it. I was keeping the weeds away from it. I was tending to it so that it sprouted and it grew, and then it ultimately flowered. But that was we talked about like how if I was dosing you slowly over a period of time, you wouldn't realize that your perception had changed, right? It was so gradual. That was my experience. It wasn't until I kind of looked back on the whole process that I was like, oh wow, it has changed entirely, right? That phrase, hindsight is 20/20. It's really hard to see it while you're going through it, but when you look back, and I try to remind you this in your yoga and your asana practice all the time, like, you remember how hard down dog used to be? Look at you now, right? Like, it's important to look back and realize just how much things have changed, because it's so easy to just get focused on the next thing, right? And always moving forward, always striving, always growing, all that stuff. So like, I'll just, I've had all those little moments in Shavasana, like you talked about. One of the most profound moments that I had, and it's not going to really sound that profound when I say it with words, but I was standing outside having some kind of existential crisis, and I was raised as a Christian, so I was looking up at the sky, and I had this thought of like, why are you looking up there? It's not up there. It's also down here. And I looked down. And then I was like, and then I looked at this pine tree, and it was like the time of day where the sun was hitting one side of the tree. So one side of the tree was totally lit up with sunlight, and the other side of the tree was just totally black, like yin and yang. And I was like, it's up there and it's down here. I was like, is divinity the light or the dark? I was like, it's both. And it's also out there, and then it hit me, like the truth like that action of aha hit me. Oh, and it's also in me. And in that moment, I felt that unity that we're always talking about finding in yoga, that our experience as a human being is one of subject and object, that I'm separate from everybody else, that I'm in this container of my body. But the reality, or the truth underneath that we can't see, is that we're just part of everything. There's really no separation between any of us, right? Any more than, like, each one of you on my screen right now is like a little wave in the ocean, right? You've come into form, but you're still connected to the ocean. And eventually you're going to return back into the ocean. You're just coming into form, right? And so I had this aha moment, and I was like, oh, that was weird. And then I turned around and went back in the house, right? And I went back to, I probably, fed the kid or did whatever I needed to do. That moment where that truth acted on me, that was the planting of the seed. And then I just continued on practicing yoga, because that's what I do. I didn't really think anything other of it than I was just continuing on with my practice. But as I was continuing on with my practice, what I was doing was now cultivating that seed that had been planted. And so that idea of that there is no separation between me and everybody else eventually started to affect everything, the way that I do everything, the way that I behave, the way that I talk to people, the way that I make decisions. Yeah.
Jordan, I thought like we could explore this point about this. So Avra, yes, how about how having many aha moments and then regressing back and dipping into suffering? And I think that kind of connects a little bit to what Andrea Hart and Monique were talking about with PTSD, because
Yes.
the whole idea about let's say either going in and out of the awakening or in and out of the enlightenment state, and like, you know, I'm a blissful yogi, I love everybody, then someone takes my spot and I'm going to throw their mat out of the room, which has happened before.
Yeah. Or yeah, exactly. I was like, you're all blissed out when you're in yoga class and smile at everybody and you're kind to everybody. And then you get to Whole Foods and somebody cuts you off and takes your parking spot. You're like, motherfucking son of a, right? Like we all do that. We all go in and out. And so that's what I mean by practice, is catching yourself in those moments. And I've talked about that many times. I had horrible road rage. Like I ran people off the road, pulled people out of their cars, got into fights, like bad, like not just screaming at people, like real road rage. And somewhere on my yogic path, I decided that probably wasn't the best form of behavior, and I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. Like obviously, I wasn't running people off the road when I decided this, but I was still screaming at people in my car, like, and at first, once I made that decision that I wasn't going to do that anymore, somebody would cut me off and I would scream and yell and give them the bird, and the whole emotional roller coaster would subside. And after it all passed, a thought would come into my brain. Oh, I thought I wasn't going to do that anymore. And that's the way it starts. Every time you do that behavior, you remind yourself that you didn't want to do that anymore. And so then the action of that emotion arising becomes the red flag that triggers you to go into self-study mode. And so as that gap gets closer and closer together, then my action started becoming, well, somebody would cut me off and I'd be like all the emotions there, but now I'm managing to at least not verbalize it, right? That's a step in the right direction. And then the next phase that I went through was somebody would cut me off and I'd be like, have a nice day. Like I was basically still saying, fuck you. And I still had all the emotion, but now I'm trying to consciously change what I'm saying. And now I'm actually, if you ask me now if I have any road rage, I'll tell you, I never drive on the highway. I take secondary roads everywhere I go. If somebody's tailgating me, I'm the guy that pulls over and I'm like, I think I literally have the thought, maybe your wife's pregnant. You need to get to the hospital. Even though I'm nowhere near a hospital, that's what I say to myself, and that diffuses all the emotion. But it's compassion. It puts me in their position. I don't, they're probably just an a-hole that's in a hurry, but I don't need to. That thinking that way causes me to spiral out into negativity, right? So I've totally changed. I don't have any road rage anymore. I've totally changed my driving behavior, right? But that takes practice and time. That's the only way you can do that. And that's why I'm saying, to go back to your example of Bob, he's in a really difficult position because he doesn't have any of these tools of practice to help him transition. So let me scroll back up here and read this that Monique read, because I thought that, so I don't know if you guys are following along with the comments. I'm just going to read it for sake of the video. So
I'm going to read Andrea's too.
Yeah, Andrea said, how do you frame PTSD that we hold on to? Is PTSD something that can be liberated through awakening? Short answer, yes. I think PTSD, Monique replied to that. She said, I think PTSD sinks into the body beyond the grasp of the mind. It becomes a vibrational injury. I believe the awakening potential comes when we can grasp that release, and liberation can't be had through our intellect alone. Pain is inevitable because we have physical form. Suffering is linked to perspective, and we have the power to shift our perspective as we become more woke. Nicely said. Yeah, really, like spot on. So, especially the whole vibrational injury thing. That's exactly what it is. PTSD is that you had an experience that was so intense that it burned an impression into your brain. And like we were talking about earlier with the sore tooth, your brain tongue can't just help. It can't help itself. It just keeps going back and poking that uncomfortable thing over and over and over again. And so I don't know how much you're familiar with this, but they've started. There's a psychologist that was working with vets with PTSD, and he got so frustrated with his conventional methods of treating them with antidepressants or whatever, and having such a high rate of suicide. He's like, basically all the treatments I had were hit or miss. He's like, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. There was no rationale or logic to it. And he got so frustrated that he started treating these soldiers with psychedelic mushrooms. And basically he was able to give them mushrooms and like put them in a nice quiet room by themselves with nice music and something comfortable to sit on, and they'd go in there and they'd have their experience, and they would all come out, and they were able to work their way through their shit. And one treatment would last 6 months to a year of them being totally symptom free. And basically what the psilocybin, I don't know how many of you have had a mushroom trip, but it basically is breaking down you've got these, think of all these little patterns of neural pathways in your brain, and each one of those is a pattern of behavior, a pattern of memory. And then in between those patterns is like barriers. And basically what psilocybin does is it comes down and drops all those barriers. So now your brain is able to make all these new connections between all these things that you couldn't see connections to before. And that allows you to heal that burned impression of that pattern of behavior that trauma caused. So, in self-study, meditation, introspection can do that same thing, but it's a lot harder and more tedious and arduous process, right? Like what the drug the medicine allows those people to do, it gets them right to a point of meditation that somebody might take 5 to 7 years to cultivate, and they just don't have the 5 to 7. When we're worried about this person killing themselves because of their suffering, we don't have 5 to 7 years to mess around. They need a medicine to get them there now. That makes sense, right? But so yeah, PTSD our brains are hardwired in a way to remember bad things more than good things, and that's an evolutionary trait. Like, it's important that we had that to get to this point in our human development, because if we didn't have that, we would forget that the last time we picked the berries at that bush, there was a bear back there, and this time it's going to eat us, right? Like, do you get that? Like, the reason we remember all the bad stuff more is because if we do, we're more likely to survive. But the problem is nowadays we don't face bears, right? I mean, that's just the reality. We've developed ourselves to a point in culture and society where, Karen, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. That's a very big, popular book on magic mushrooms right now.
Jordan, so to be mindful of our time.
Oh yeah. What time were we saying we were going to go to?
Well, we set this for an hour, but we can always.
That's never enough time. That always goes by so fast.
I think I think actually Helen had a really good question.
Okay, let me go. Let me gear it back. I missed some of it. Okay, is this the tapas you talk about? Yes. Yeah, tapas is austerity. And tapas, basically you can either choose to do tapas, which is pick something that makes you uncomfortable, because when there's uncomfortableness, it shakes you outside your comfort zone. It gives you more things to look at and study yourself and hopefully find things that you're not seeing clearly. But also life will force us into tapas. That's what's so amazing about this moment right now, is globally, every human being has been forced into tapas. We're in an uncomfortable situation that we don't want to be in, and we have to deal with it. And in that pressure, your character bubbles up to the surface, right? Like you get to see what you're made of. for a later conversation, but it strikes me that some folks, the practice, time, and self-study are more readily available than it is for others. It is our tremendous privilege to dwell in this space. Yes, I'll talk. Perhaps our work is to give vocabulary to Bob, but to connect and attempt to empathize. Yes, intersecting rather than interjecting his real and valid narrative. Yes, yeah, you can't dismiss Bob's experience and just tell him you should chill out and be fine with it. That's not helpful. If you're really at a higher or a more further place on the path than Bob, this is where what we do as teachers. It's our job to meet you and be able to see where you're at, and then work with you there and help to get you to dig a hole through the wall of snow and help you get out. Right?
I think that would be a good way to like kind of, I don't want to say wrap up because this is a huge conversation, but I think help the piece about why is self-study more readily available to some than others?
So there is a yoga answer for that, and I'm not saying, before I say this, I just want to preface this. When I say this kind of stuff, I'm not saying you ought to believe this or you need to accept this. This is just the information, and I'm going to present you with the information, and you can take it for what it's worth. The yogic answer for that is you gotta go with the theory of transmigration or reincarnation, right? So the reason it's so readily available to us is because we've been born into a fortunate human life. And the reason we're in a fortunate human life is because we've gone through other lives, right? So the progression is something similar to this. You have to go through all of your animal lives, and through those animal lives, you're developing mindfulness. And then it takes that mindfulness, once you've cultivated mindfulness, to get to a human life. And most of us come into a human life and we have no virtue. What I mean by that is, I'll just use a pretty blunt example. Somebody punches you in the face, and your response is to turn around and punch them back. And that just continues the cycle of punching each other in the face. So now we go through our whole life getting punched in the face and punching them back, and then we die and we come back into another human life and we get punched in the face and we punch them back, and we go through that cycle a whole bunch of times. Then ultimately we get to this moment where we're like, maybe I shouldn't punch you in the face. And now we've developed virtue, right? And so it takes mindfulness and virtue to get to a fortunate human life, right? Which means you've all gone through those steps, which has gotten you to a fortunate human life. What do we mean by a fortunate human life? Well, you were born into a family maybe that got you thinking about religious or spiritual things from birth, or you were born into a family that has good resources that provided you with education, and you never had to worry about food or malnutrition, right? Like you've been born into, anybody that lives in America has been born into a fortunate human life, right? Even the poorest people in this country are doing better than a lot of the world. So now this is where I love the Indian philosophy. So what happens when you get to a fortunate human life is that how do entitled people tend to behave? Pretty shitty, right? So you get to this fortunate human life, and then you blow it by losing your mindfulness and your virtue and your entitlement, and that causes you to have to go back and start the whole pattern all over again. So the idea is that we want to get to our fortunate human life and then continue with our mindfulness and our virtue, and that is what leads to transcending suffering. And then if you want to take that to the end of the theory, at that point, when you die at the end of that life, you then have the opportunity to transcend being born and dying. You've learned everything that you needed to learn, and so now you transcend birth and death. Or you decide to go back and take on another birth solely for the purpose of helping all the other people, and those you've heard the term bodhisattva before. That's what makes you a bodhisattva. Is You've been liberated in a previous life and you came back and took another birth simply for the purpose of helping everybody else that's still stuck. So you can take that for what it's worth, right? That's why it's available to some and not to others, right? But yoga has all of those hard questions that we struggle with, like why do good things happen or bad things happen to good people? Because we don't know what they were doing in their last life. That's the yogic answer, right? Maybe they were a horrible person in their last life, and now they're experiencing all those things that they did to other people to help them transcend that. And now in their next life, they'll come back and have a more fortunate birth. Or why do these horrible people seem to just have everything going their way? Well, maybe they made it to their fortunate human life and now they're blowing it and they're going to have to go back to the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. That's the yogic answer for those tough questions. I don't know that I can't personally in good consciousness put that into the category of truth, right? That's my favorite theory. I like the theory of reincarnation. I think it makes the most sense, but I have to keep it firmly in the area of this is theory because I can't remember dying and coming back. So yeah.
Cool. So I think that we'll plan.
Do we want to stop?
I think we can keep going, but I think what the whole point is, we should probably do more of these in the future.
Yeah, I think we've gotten to a good point. What I'd like you to do is, while you're chewing on all this, write down the questions that come to mind, so the next time we meet, you have all those things that we can talk about, right? Because that's how we can. I've kind of given you like here's all this stuff to chew on, but in order for us to move forward, I need to know what points you're stuck on. Okay?
Cool.
You guys are great. Thank you.
Good job, everybody.
Yeah. All right. Stay strong.
Thank you.
Healthy. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jordan, Braxton.
You're very welcome.
Good job.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
You did a good job keeping me on, herding me back onto the path and keeping me on target, which was good. I really appreciate